Thanks for coming. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the lighting and rendering pipeline. If you have, you'll know that rendering is traditionally the last step of the process as far as CG goes before you start going into post-production and creating your final. But it really needs to be one of the first things you think about when you're creating your animation, when you're creating your shots, because ultimately the look that you're going for needs to be in mind as you're creating your assets, as you're creating your figures. So in this presentation, we'll be talking about how to output your renders to give you the most control in the composite phase, so you don't have to re-render everything when you have changed your mind or your supervisor or your director has asked you to change things. So part of that process is being able to render in separate passes. And what I mean by passes is we have a final image here, and that final image is made up of different components of lighting. And being in control of each of those components gives you really the most flexibility in creating the look that you want. As we all know, when you're rendering a scene, it could take hours, days, weeks of render time. So being able to change something after it's already been rendered is actually a very important topic. And the industry standard in pretty much every visual effects house and every animation program is to have that control in composite. And of course, composite is when you're bringing together the different visual elements of your film together or of your project together. So when your image is rendered, it will likely need some sort of work, some sort of color correction, some sort of sweetening. If you were next door taking a look at some of the great work that Base Effects showed in the keynote address, you saw that there were a lot of layers that came together, and that process is compositing. And that is incredibly important even for shots that don't have live action plates, things like Star Wars where you have actors and backgrounds that are shot. Even if it's completely CG, you still want to think in layers to have that kind of control. So some of the most common adjustments are changing color. And that is a very important, very key element to being able to balance your entire film together. And having that control is, like I said, very, very important. So rendering in separate passes, again, they all come back into composite. And the compositing of all those elements gives you that final image when it's all layered back together. And here is an example in After Effects. We'll be talking more about that process. Now, when I talk about passes, layers, components, AOVs, these are all different terms that different renderers and different studios use to talk about the layers that they output through CG. And we have here basically a very simple render of a ball. Could we perhaps lower the light a little bit so we can see the screen? You can see this is the beauty element, meaning that's the final image that you want to output. But that has a number of different elements that can be used in the post process to put that back together. Some of the elements, layers, AOVs, or passes that you can use are the RGB pass, which is also known as the beauty pass. This is the red, green, and the blue. This is basically what is the final image. And then we have things that most everybody knows, the alpha channel, which gives you a mask or a matte, and some other things like specular reflections, refractions, lights and lighting, and so forth. We'll be taking a look at all those in a case study. Now, using V-Ray as a renderer, we're able to output what are called elements, and elements are the passes, the layers that I'm talking about. In V-Ray, they're called elements. And there's a very large number of elements that you can output. A lot of different renderers will have their own list, but typically you'll get at least 20 to 30 different elements or layers that you can output through any different render. And V-Ray has quite a few of them. So here we have an image that we're going to put back together in this presentation, taking a look at each of its elements together. Some of the things you'll notice, we have a background, we have outdoor lighting, we have sunlight coming in, we've got shadows, we've got a lot of metal here. So some of the most obvious render elements would be the alpha channel, and the alpha channel acts like a mat to allow you to cut different parts of the image and put it back together. And that's pretty standard. The alpha channel is typically saved in with the file. If you have a TIFF or possibly a Targa, RGB A, alpha is the A part of that equation. Also, we have a background. Again, this is something that's fairly obvious as a render element. It's your background. It's what goes in the back. Usually skies are typically treated as just the background. And then fog or atmosphere. And that's something that not a lot of people think about, especially with a full CG production, is the effect of atmosphere. There's density in air, there's vapor, there's gases, there might be fog, there might be smoke. All of these things change depth perception of how we look at things and how we see things. So using atmosphere, in this case fog, you can really add a lot of depth to your composition. So these are pretty obvious render layers that pretty much everybody would be somewhat familiar with. When you start really professional lighting workflow, you want to be able to cut everything apart. So what we have here are two different lighting elements from that original image that I showed you. We have a direct light and we have an indirect light. A direct light is when a surface is illuminated from a light. An indirect light is when light bounces from a different surface and helps illuminate your subject. And that's what real light does. And understanding how real light works is the cornerstone of rendering. We have lots of things. For example, if you look under your table, it's not purely black because light is bouncing off of the floor and then helping light the bottom of the tables in front of you, and that's where indirect light comes from. And in rendering, that's typically known as global illumination. Possibly also radiosity is a popular term for that. So that indirect light, these two combine together to create the illumination for your scene. Now, having these as separate passes gives you great control because you're able to go into your direct light, for example, and change the color very easily, change the intensity very easily. So for example, if we go back to our original image, if the director of this production had said, you know, the sun in this area is not bright enough. I want more light there. I want it to feel more of a morning as opposed to more of an afternoon. You can go to your lighting element and you can add more orange to make it look more of a morning. You can add more brightness to make it brighter. So when it composites back together, you have a much sharper, much stronger, much more orange coloring. Previous to rendering in elements, you would have to re-render that shot. You would have to go back and redo all of that work and relight and re-render. I've been on productions, on commercial productions where, and this is commercials and not feature film. Commercials are very short times, much smaller crews, much less resources. We've had renders that were 30, 40 hours per frame. And re-rendering a shot like that would just kill you. You would be late and your client would come to your house and murder you. It would be a very bad thing. So being able to have these passes, you could adjust a lot. Similarly, with the indirect light, creating more color, more or less intensity really will change how your final light looks. Then there are some of the surface components of light. Now, lighting is not just about light. It's not about just putting lights into a scene and saying this light is yellow and this light is blue and this light is green. This is this bright and that is that bright. It's also about surface, and it's about how light reflects from a surface. And that tells you the mood and the atmosphere in the scene. At the end of a day, any image, any project, any film or animation that you create has to tell some sort of story, has to give some form of narrative, some sort of story that tells you, the audience, why am I sitting here watching this? And that translates into all sorts of things. The performances from the actors or the performances from the characters, the production design, the costume design, but also from lighting as well. Lighting can add a tremendous amount to the story and to the narrative, to the feeling, to the reaction of the audience. So being in control of that is actually quite important. So here what we have are a few different a few different surface components that help define what these surfaces are. Is it metallic? Is it reflective? Is it dull? Is it like the carpet on the floor? Is it like the paneling on the wall? Is it like the metal in these chandeliers? Those surfaces give you visual cues as to how they react to lighting. So having control of these is very important. Here we have specular. Now, specular is defined as the reflection of light at a specific angle where the rays bouncing off of that surface are pretty much at that glancing angle, and they'll change. A regular reflection, as you'll see with this kind of pass, is much more about the diffuse environment, what's in that world. And this is something that's incredibly important to understand about the work that you do. It's not necessarily about just the subject in the image. It's about the universe that surrounds that image. One popular question that I pose to all my students is, what is the color of a red ball in a black room with no light? The answer is red? Is it black? Color is subjective. It really depends on the perception of the person, and it really depends on the light that comes to it. The same thing can be said of the emotional impact of your scene, and how you control that surface shares that mentality with you. So we have reflections, and you can see a lot of the trim in this wagon is all this chrome, and that's the thing about metal. The color of metal is its environment. So when you're thinking about creating a scene, you really have to think about what's around that scene and what's in the world of that scene, because ideally that is what's reflecting into your work, and that is what's coming out. And metal is a prime example for that, because most of the look of that metal comes from the reflection component, the reflection element. And then we have a little bit of refraction, which is light going through translucent materials like glass. What do you see behind glass and other translucent materials, for example? Now, outputting these render elements is actually pretty easy. A lot of renderers already calculate all of these things, so turning it on doesn't mean it needs to render every single time. It doesn't need to go in and do each render again and again and again for every layer that you turn on, because the calculations are already being done. It's just a matter of enabling that output and getting those files out. There's a few different ways of getting those files. You can get them as separate files. So for every render element, for every frame, you could have a TIFF, or you can use a multi-channel, like an OpenEXR file that stores a lot more channels than just the red, the green, the blue, and the alpha. So for example, one EXR file could contain all of those elements, which makes it a lot easier to go into Composite and bring in your footage. So instead of having 20 different folders full of files, you just have one. And that file contains the 20 different channels that you might have. And when you go into Composite, then you start breaking out those channels and rebuilding everything. And that process is typically known as back to beauty. Now, this may be shocking, but digital images are all about math and how it contains the image, how it portrays the colors are all saved as different numbers, different values for the amount of red and the amount of green, the amount of blue, and it's all mathematical. So the compositing process is also expressed in terms of math, adding layers, multiplying layers, subtracting layers. This is the terminology that's used in compositing, and it's important to know because as you're putting your beauty together, you'll want to know how these layers come. And typically, they're all added on top of each other. Most renderers will set up their elements to be simple additions. So in After Effects, for example, you would be using transfer modes, and you'd be using an additive transfer mode. In Nuke, you would be doing a blend node with the add function in Nuke instead. So, for example, here we have a lighting pass, which is the combination of all the light that's in the scene. We have a reflection pass, which is all the reflections. We have a little bit of the GI, which is the bounce light. You can see some of the bounce light inside the tube and outside here. We've got a little bit of specular. We've got some refraction. Subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering is a complex surface like skin, like marble, soap, wax. Because light doesn't just hit a surface like that, like skin for example, it doesn't just reflect off of that surface, it also penetrates that surface and helps illuminate that surface on the inside. So when light is hitting my skin, it's actually going into the skin and giving it a little bit of a glow. For example, if I had a flashlight shining behind my ear would appear a little bit red. And who's never done that as a kid, taking a flashlight and putting it on your hand and seeing if you can see your bones through with a flashlight? That is a subsurface effect. That's also translucency, where light is going through a surface, through an object as well. And that, in CG terms, is subsurface scattering. That calculation is based on the material. It calculates how much light is coming in. It calculates how much light is going through, and gives you a render element that takes this wax sphere and gives it a different lighting. As you can see, none of the other elements really have much of that ball. And here is that ball in lighting. There's no diffuse lighting from the ball. It's all considered wax subsurface scatter. So that's where that shows up. And also, I'll talk a little bit about this in a few subsequent slides. You also have mats, where you're able to divide parts of your render into different parts, so you can treat things differently. So as far as V-Ray, and I would say most other renderers, give or take, as far as they're concerned, the basic back to beauty equation is this, where you take the lighting, you add global illumination. So the direct light plus the indirect light will give you your total illumination, your total lighting. On top of that, you add your reflections. So what am I talking about when I say add? Well, as I mentioned before, color is math. It's based in values. So a value, a color in an image of black is a mathematical value of 0, where a white value is numerically 1. So what happens when you add 0 and 0? You get 0. Basically, black on black equals black. If you add 1 on top of 0, you get 1. So taking an element like this, where the majority is dark, where it's black, none of this area will really change the final composite because it's 0. So adding will take a lot of these parts, a lot of that reflection, a lot of the white areas and some of the colored areas, and compile onto the base, onto the light. Well, I have some more examples I'll show you as we go along. So these two combined with the reflection, you add specular. In real life, specular reflections and regular reflections combine, and we add the refraction, any subsurface scattering, plus any self-illumination. What I mean by self-illumination are screens like this, where there's a lot of light that seems to come from them, or from lamps, like we have these bulbs in these chandeliers above. Those are self-illuminated, meaning the lights that they give off are greater than the light that they're receiving from the environment. And you get your final render where everything's added back together. So mathematically, it's fairly simple. It's just a matter of knowing which layers to put in order. So here's that scene where we've taken the background and we're going to add the lighting on top of the background. And this is fairly easy to see how it comes together, mostly because it's a pretty straightforward matte, pretty straightforward alpha. These add together to create your combined image. So here's our composite so far, and now we add GI. And you can see this is direct light, meaning these shadowed areas are not receiving any light. That's not how the real life light works. Light bounces around until it loses enough energy where it loses its value. So when you add these two together, you have your total lighting. And this image gives you probably the best preview of what your image is going to look like at the very end. It gives you the full lighting of your scene, but there's still quite a few key elements, namely the reflections, that are still missing. So here we have the environmental of all the light in the scene and how your objects react, and on top of that, we add the reflections. And this is, you can see the reflections obviously in the metal, but also there's a lot of other reflections. Light is inherently about reflections. What you see is a reflection. Everything that you see is a reflection. By definition, light leaves a source, hits a surface, bounces off and goes into your eye, and then you perceive that. So rendering with the mindset of what am I reflecting, what is in my world, is crucial. and is one of the things that you really have to think about when you're creating your scenes. It's not enough to just think about your characters and your scene and what they're doing in the performance, but you really have to think about what's the world that they're in. So moving on, here's our composite so far, and we have a small render element here of refractions. Basically, what is coming through the window of our little trailer, and there's a small net difference here, where you can see this area has been added to the glass for that window, and that's the refractions. Of course, at every step of the process, this is where the control is. You can change the intensity, the amount, the color. You can blur it somewhat to give all sorts of different cues visually as to how your image is coming together. Now we add the specular component. Again, specular is very loosely defined as the reflection of your light source, and is important in showing how glossy your material is. And by glossy, I mean how shiny it is. For example, the more wet a surface looks, the more glossy it becomes. So if I were to take my hand, for example, I was to pour some water on it, parts of my hand would be more glossy than the dry parts of my hand. One of the challenges for look development and lighting artists is to create surfaces that look believable and natural. And a lot of the care is put into how glossy specular and reflections look, because they control most everything. Materials such as the V-Ray material inside of V-Ray has a huge amount of potential. You can make that one material look like a huge range of surfaces, from a carpet that isn't very glossy or reflective to metal that is extremely reflective. So here we have the specular component that we are adding on, and you may not think that some things like this cloth, this canvas for the seat, actually is glossy. It has some manner of specular reflection to it. Towards the end of the composite is when we start adding the atmosphere. And that atmosphere is very important because it helps give you depth. There's a few ways of creating atmosphere in a composite. One of them is by literally using an atmosphere like fog, but also the further back you are in a scene, the less saturated the colors become perceptually when we're looking at things. So in the far distance, things will seem less colorful than they are when they're closer to us. Controlling that will get to utility passes that I'll talk about in just a moment as well. So we take all of those layers that I've just shown out. This, believe it or not, is just a basic Back to Beauty composite. Those are the basic layers that you can output. So if you want the most basic control over what your lighting does in composite, that's the minimum of the layers that you want to output. So here's a view of this in Adobe After Effects, where all of these layers are all added on top of each other in the transfer mode. So literally, you're layering a cake, a delicious, delicious cake. So here's a close-up of what we're looking at, where we've got, starting with the background, we add the lighting on top, GI, reflection, refraction, specular, and our environment fog. Now that scene, I believe, did not have any subsurface scattering on top of that. That would probably fit somewhere around here between these layers. Ultimately, you can move layers a little bit depending on how you want it to look. But by and large, that equation that I showed you earlier is pretty much how at least V-Ray comes back together. Excuse me. So again, we're using add blend mode for a lot of these. Some render elements, if you choose to break out shadows, for example, if you have a shadow render element, that would be a subtract, because you are removing light from your composite. And the shadow render elements would be fitting in after your base lighting. So your total lighting, which is the light plus your GI, minus shadows at that point. You've heard of ambient occlusion passes, right? So ambient occlusion is not physically real per se. What it means is when two surfaces get together, one occludes or helps block some of the light going to the other surface. What it's really useful for is accentuating small details like seams in my shirt right here. With my pocket on top of my shirt, there's a little tiny bit of a shadow that runs where the pocket material meets the shirt material. That is very well shown off in an ambient occlusion pass. We'll see a pass of that in a moment, but that becomes a multiply. And I'll show you why that's a multiply in a moment. So the basic composite is exactly this. And this is also achievable in Nuke, Digital Fusion, many different types of compositing packages, or even Photoshop. And here's our beauty composite with everything put back together. Now you may look at that and say, well, I just hit render and that's what I'm going to get anyway. It does take a little bit more time for you to put everything back together, but in the end, the amount of time you save by putting out all the different channels, by compositing all the different channels together, is tremendous. If the director comes to me and says, I want that trailer to be red instead of blue. I want the time, as I mentioned earlier, I want it to be early morning as opposed to late afternoon. All of these things I can change within hours as opposed to taking days to relight and re-render that scene. Some tips, some beauty tips that will allow you to change things, for example. So the effect of any layer that you put into After Effects can be lowered by just adjusting its opacity. So how much global illumination that you add onto your lighting layer, if you don't want that much bounce light, just reduce the opacity of it. If you want more, double it up. Add 2 layers of global illumination. One at 100% and one at maybe 10%, 15%. Of course, any of those layers could also be color corrected at that point as well. Specular, for example. If you don't want something to be as shiny, just reduce the specularity, reduce its opacity, bring it down 30%, 40%, whatever works best. For example, we have 2 different images here where we've got much more mood, we've got much darker shadows than this one that has had additional GI added to it to lift the whole scene. You may be thinking, well, I could do that with just a brightness and contrast. I can take the whole image, the single image that I've rendered, and output that into contrast, brighten it up a little bit, bring up the gain. That lifts everything. In lighting, though, if it were a brighter day, lighting would be different. The shadows wouldn't get any brighter, would they? If it's a brighter day, the shadow would still be fairly dark. But if you did a brightness contrast on the whole image, then everything will become more gray and you will start losing some of your blacks. So by just adjusting the global illumination, the indirect lighting pass, we're able to create a little bit more of a mood where this image is more interesting than this one, because the one here seems a little bit more flat. That's how much a little bit of change can affect your image. The very top feature work, again, some of the great work that we saw next door from Base Effects, a lot of the time spent creating that top level work is spent in the very last 10% of the process itself. Creating all the models, creating all the textures, animating everything, lighting everything, rendering everything, comping everything. That takes up 90% of your time, you would think, but it doesn't. It's 90% of your effort. That's 90% of how much stuff do we get done. But the last 10% that takes you from, it looks pretty good, to, wow, it's approved by J.J. Abrams, that last 10% takes up most of your time. And that's what's key here to understand about your work. If you're doing student work, if you're doing your own personal films, if you're showing off your work as you go out into the industry, the more of this finishing, the more of this final step that you understand, the more your work will be seen professionally. The more you'll be seen as a professional lighter or as a professional artist, because that is really where your image goes from to wow. As I mentioned many times already, each render element can be color corrected. We could change the color of the specular to make it seem like more of a sunrise scene pretty quickly. And I've already talked about, all we did was change the opacity of the GI layer to change the mood and make this a more interesting composition. I mentioned earlier as well about utility elements, and there are so many utility elements that you can output, especially through V-Ray, that make the composite a lot easier to handle. One of the most key utility elements is the top one here are matte passes. And this in V-Ray is typically called the multi-matte. Because what you're able to do here is you're able to differentiate different parts of your scene, different parts of your image, so you can adjust these things differently. So as I mentioned before, if the director comes in and says, you know what, I have 10 minutes and this has to be on television, and I really need to change the color of the wagon, you have that control. This multi-matte can be taken into After Effects, and you would use what's called the Set Matte plugin. It comes with After Effects. It's part of the, I believe it's in the channel submenu. If you go to channels, you'll find Set Matte. And what that allows you to do is use a channel from any other layer in your composite to be the alpha channel for whatever you're doing in that layer. So I could create an adjustment layer, use Set Matte, and say, hey, use the multi-matte layer, use the red channel, and that will basically give me just the wagon, minus all the metal and the glass and everything, just giving me the body of the wagon, so I can go into After Effects and change anything I want about it. Change its color, and so on and so forth. At this stage, would I do that at the full composite? Would I change the color? Let's go back to our render. If I want to turn this red from that cyan blue, would I take the Set Matte and would I use that on the final composite to make that a red wagon? No, I wouldn't. I would not use the final composite. I would go all the way back to here. Why? Because that's where the color is. That's where the surface color is. Everything else that goes on top of the surface color is something that happens after the color happens on that surface. So if I had, let's say, plastic on top of my shirt, the blue color comes from the cloth. The reflections and everything else comes from the plastic on top of the cloth. And that's how you want to look at it. If you color corrected the wagon from blue to red at the end of the comp on top of everything, then everything else will be tinted red as well. And that's not what you want. So that is a significant part, because as you can see, a lot of what you see on the surface of the wagon is a reflection. So if you change the color to red, then you're also changing the color of the environment to red as well. You still want this blue and this sand, this beige color, to remain blue and sand color, because that's your environment. Does that make sense? Yeah? So let's go back to our utilities. Another great utility is Z-depth. The Z-depth pass gives you positional information. How far are you from the camera? And the further away you are, the brighter that pass gets. And that's what you can use to layer in depth information. I mentioned before, perceptually, when we're looking at something, the further back it goes, the less saturated it looks. This is what you would use. You would use this as a matte in After Effects as you're using an adjustment layer to desaturate. You would use this as a matte that says, the brighter it is, the less saturated I want it to become, right? And then another I spoke about a little earlier is the ambient occlusion pass. And what this is really good for is giving detail in different parts of your image. For example, the seams where the doors are, or the little areas of the palm trees, because palm trees, they're not perfectly flat surfaces. There's a lot of stuff on top of a tree trunk. So, oops, wrong button. So some of that information can come through pretty well in an ambient occlusion pass. This is multiplied on top of your final comp. Why multiply? As I mentioned before, white is 1. What happens when you multiply anything by 1? It remains the same. But what happens when you multiply something by 0? It becomes black. So this helps you show detail, surfaces, crevices, cracks, things like that, wrinkles, dimples, things like that come out, as long as it's used very, very sparingly. You don't want to use that much of it, because it's not really a photographically light accurate phenomenon. It's something that's pretty much computer generated, so it helps accentuate the scene. So with that, I want to thank you, and thanks for MDEC for having me here. I wanted to open the floor to any questions that hopefully I will be able to answer for you. I'd love for this to be as much of a back and forth. I want to commend everybody for coming, and I really believe that education is a cornerstone to a happy life, and education is all about talking back and forth. I don't know everything, you don't know everything, but together we know a little bit more. So please, I would love any sorts of questions that you may have.
All right. Any question from the floor? Yes. Can we have a runner to pass the mic to the gentleman there? Introduce yourself, where you are from.
Hi, I'm Jonathan from Equator College. I want to ask about the multi-mat pass.
Yes.
And is there a limit to how many channels you can apply, and how do we actually use this to we use it as an sort of an alpha, correct? And we don't have to re-render every object separately by using this method. But is there any limitations, or how far can we go with it?
It's a fantastic question. You know, with an alpha channel, you only have black and white. So where you see white, that's your protection, that's your matte. And where you see black, you go right through, right? So what a multi-matte does is it gives you 3 alpha channels in one shot. And because red, green, and blue are the 3 components of digital color, you're very easily able to tell After Effects, use blue and that becomes a new alpha. Use green and that becomes its own alpha. So what you do in your scene with V-Ray, you assign objects ID numbers. And you say at rendering, object ID 3 renders green. Object ID 2 renders blue, for example. So if you have, let's say, 12 different objects, you'll have 4 different multi-matte passes. And each one will have 3 in them.
So like instead of you having RGBA where A is alpha, each of our RGBA will be their own alphas, right? And
Once you use it in conjunction with set matte, for example, that one channel becomes alpha. So if I went to set matte and I said make blue my channel for any specific layer, this will act like an alpha channel for only the surfboard, for only this blue surfboard sitting, you know. Or if I said set matte to be green, then the ground surface would become, it's almost as if I rendered just the ground by itself as an alpha channel. And that's the power, because it's calculating all these things while it's doing its render, so you don't have to go into different layers and turn objects on and off, white and black, by using an object ID. You can also use a material ID, where you say any object that has this material will be a matte of green. You can use different colors as well. You can have the whole gamut of colors, but at that point you're also keying. So let's say I use purple, I would have to key purple to create a matte just for purple.
Yeah, which is not the same with channels.
Which is, exactly, because the channel is inherent. So red is red, blue is blue, green is green. And these are all very flat, pure, like the red is 1, 0, 0.
Right.
The blue is 0,
because
1,
it's
0.
in channels, we're limited to having R, G, and P as selections. And if we want to have more options, we need to do separate matte passes.
Exactly, you would do multiple of these passes. So I could have a few more of these that help define the tree trunks, or the leaves, or the background, or the chair. All of those could be different multi-mattes. So in any one project, I could have 5, 6 different RGB multi-mattes, 1, 2, and they're all named multi-matte 1, multi-matte 2, multi-matte 3, and then pull them into After Effects and say, use the red from this one, and use the green from that one, and use the blue from the first one, and that way you can really fine-tune all the objects in your scene.
Thank you, it's very clear.
Great, wonderful.
All right, thank you very much. Any other question? One last question before we proceed to the next one. Any question? All right, yes, your name and your question. And intern from, what's your company's name again?
Hello, my name is Jinyang. Currently is
Coloring?
working as intern in Blue Studios.
Okay.
So first of all, thank you for clearing everything up. At least now I know all the hierarchies of the passes and
Wonderful.
the blend mode. Just want to ask, because other than using add as blend mode, there's screen too. Any difference
Yes.
between them?
Screen and add are only slightly different. Screen tends to be a little bit less intense than add. Add gives you pure mathematical add, where screen actually takes anywhere from 5 to 10% of the brightness away when its screen's on top, because it's actually filtering some of the brightness away from it. So to get exactly what you're looking for, it's best to use add, and then use opacity to bring down if you want to control how much effect that layer has. But you can use screen as well. In the end, it all comes down to what you see and how you like it. And if you think that screen looks better on some layers, you can surely go ahead and use screen. Mathematically, though, you'd want to use add to get exactly what the beauty is supposed to be.
So which means same things applies to shadows, which you still can use what you call instead of subtract, you can use multiply.
With subtract and multiply would work very differently. Multiply, when you have a layer like a shadow layer, the color that is represented in that element needs to physically be subtracted, minused from the color. And the multiply is if you have a white and black image where you want to darken areas, that's when you want to use multiply. And that is almost universally only helpful for ambient occlusion. Some shadow, if you do what's called a matte shadow pass, that may give you black shadows on pure white background. In that case, you want to use a multiply for that type of shadow.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's give Dariush a big round of applause. Thank you very much for that very insightful presentation from Dariush.